The desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in the gray-violet hues of pre-dawn. Somewhere below the cloud deck, 6 Navy SEALs pressed their backs against cold stone, hearts hammering as the silence pressed in. They'd been compromised. The exfil bird was 19 minutes out. The enemy was 3 minutes closer. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb keyed his radio twice. No words, just the click that meant we're in trouble. At Bagram, the Joint Operations Center erupted in controlled chaos. Screens flickered with thermal signatures, drone feeds painting the mountainside in shades of green and black. The QRF Blackhawks were spooling up, but everyone in that room knew the math. The SEALs had maybe 12 minutes before the Taliban fighters cresting the ridge would have firing solutions. Colonel Hendricks stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, scanning faces for options nobody had. That's when Captain Rhea Marchant walked in, flight suit still damp with sweat from the morning's patrol sortie, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She'd heard the call sign over the net. Archangel 6, troops in contact, danger close. Hendricks barely glanced at her. Warthog's too slow. We need fast movers. F-16s are 30 minutes out, sir. I'm 15. Her voice was steady, flat, not pleading, statting. Marchant, this is a hot LZ with friendlies inside 100 meters. You'll be making gun runs in a granite bowl with Sams in the valley. Yes, sir, that's what I do. Hendricks studied her for 3 seconds that felt like 30. Everyone knew her story, even if they didn't talk about it. The pilot who'd washed out of fighter school on a technicality, reassigned to the A-10 when the Air Force still considered it a retirement platform for has-beens and never-weres. Her call sign was Ghostwalk, a name she'd earned not in glory but in silence, flying missions nobody else wanted, bringing damaged birds home when seasoned pilots said it couldn't be done. Some said she was reckless, others said she was just stubborn. Hendricks knew she was both. Get airborne, Archangel 6 is yours. She was out the door before he finished the sentence. Outside, the tarmac shimmered under floodlights. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II sat like a brooding gargoyle, ugly, angular, built around a gun so massive it seemed impossible the aircraft could fly. The titanium bathtub cockpit gleamed dully. Crew Chief Ramirez was already pulling chocks. They're sending you. He didn't hide his concern. They're sending me. She pulled on her helmet, fingers moving through the pre-flight checklist from muscle memory. The Pratt & Whitney turbofans whined to life. Dawn was still 20 minutes away when Ghostwalk pushed the throttles forward and rolled into the darkness. The mountains waited ahead, silent and immense. Somewhere in their folds, 6 men counted seconds. They didn't know Salvation wore a flight suit and spoke in the thunder of a 30mm cannon. Not yet. The tactical frequency crackled as she climbed. Archangel 6, this is Ghostwalk inbound your position, 15 mics. How copy? The response came through static and gunfire. Ghostwalk, we are contact North Ridge taking fire, the transmission cut. Rhea's hands tightened on the stick. The HUD displayed the waypoint coordinates, the elevation warnings, the fuel calculations. All of it painted a picture that said this was going to cost something. She pushed the nose down, accelerating. The A-10 wasn't graceful. It didn't slip through the sky like an eagle. It muscled through, a flying tank that refused to accept the physics that said it shouldn't exist, just like her. Below, the valleys yawned open, black and deep. Thermal bloom from cook fires dotted the terrain. She switched to infrared, watching the landscape resolve into shapes. There, the ridge. Muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness like angry fireflies. She counted at least 40 hostiles advancing on a position that had gone dark. Archangel 6, Ghostwalk has visual, authenticate grid. No response. Just the open carrier wave and the sound of distant thunder. Could be mortars. Could be the world ending for 6 men who'd never see sunrise. Rhea armed the gun. The GAU-8 Avenger was a monster, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds the size of soda bottles at 4,000 rounds per minute. The A-10 didn't carry the gun. The gun carried the A-10. She rolled inverted, pulled the nose through the horizon, and dove. The airspeed indicator climbed. 200 knots, 250, 300. The A-10 shuddered, complaining she didn't care. At 4,000 feet, she rolled wings level and saw them. 6 thermal signatures huddled against an outcropping, surrounded by dozens more advancing in a loose crescent. No way to thread this needle without putting rounds within spitting distance of friendlies. Archangel 6, if you can hear me, mark your position with IR strobe. I'm coming in hot. A tiny flicker of infrared light pulsed below. She adjusted her angle, calculating winds, elevation, the margin of error that separated salvation from catastrophe. Her finger rested on the trigger. The desert held its breath. Then Ghostwalk opened fire. The sound was biblical. Not a rattle but a roar, a deep bass vibration that seemed to tear the fabric of the world. The cannon's recoil slowed the aircraft, physics asserting dominance, as a stream of fire reached down from the sky and carved a line across the ridgeline. Rocks exploded. Bodies disappeared. The advancing crescent evaporated into chaos and dust. She pulled up, banking hard left, feeling the G-forces compress her chest. Tracer fire reached up from the valley, green streaks clawing toward her. She ignored it, rolling into another attack run. Archangel 6, Ghostwalk, how copy? Ghostwalk, contact broken, you just saved. The transmission dissolved into something that might have been a laugh or a sob. She lined up again. The gun spoke. Then again, each pass choreographed with brutal precision. The A-10 carved figure eights in the sky, an ugly angel dealing judgment with 30mm precision. On the 4th pass, something bit back. The aircraft shuddered. Red lights flickered across her instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure dropping in the port system. She'd taken a hit. Could be small arms, could be a lucky RPG fragment, didn't matter. The A-10 was designed to absorb punishment. She kept flying. Ghostwalk, be advised, QRF inbound 3 minutes. Can you maintain station? Affirmative. Nobody's getting close to my guys. My guys, she'd said it without thinking. On the ground, Staff Sergeant Webb pressed against the stone, ears ringing, watching that ugly, beautiful aircraft carve circles overhead. He didn't know the pilot's name. Didn't know she'd been told she wasn't good enough, wasn't fast enough, wasn't the right fit. He just knew that when the world was ending, she'd shown up. The Blackhawks thundered in low, fast-stroping the QRF into a defensive perimeter. The SEALs moved, exhausted, grateful, alive. Rhea stayed overhead until every man was accounted for, loaded, airborne. Only then did she turn for home, nursing the wounded A-10 back toward base as dawn finally broke over the Hindu Kush. She didn't know that Webb had asked for her name. Didn't know that in the JOC, Colonel Hendricks was watching her approach Vector with something like awe. She was just flying, focused on keeping the crippled bird stable, monitoring systems that were bleeding pressure and throwing warnings. The tower cleared her for straighten approach, emergency equipment standing by. She brought it in smooth, touching down light despite the damage. When the wheels chirped on tarmac, something released in her chest, not relief exactly, but the absence of tension that had been her companion since takeoff. She taxied to the hardstand, shut down the engines, and sat in silence for a moment. Through the canopy, she could see Ramirez running toward the aircraft, eyes wide. She popped the canopy and climbed out, legs stiff, hands still tingling with adrenaline. The A-10's fuselage was stitched with holes. 27 they'd count later. Rounds through the tail, the wings, one that had punched through the titanium bathtub inches from her seat. Any other aircraft would have fallen from the sky. The A-10 had just kept flying. Jesus, Captain. Ramirez ran his hand along the perforated metal. How'd you keep this thing in the air? Wasn't me, she wanted to come home. Rhea pulled off her helmet, hair plastered to her scalp, face marked with the imprint of her oxygen mask. She looked at the damage and felt nothing but gratitude. For the engineers who'd built this ugly, magnificent machine. For whatever luck had kept her alive. For the mission that had mattered. Inside the JOC, word spread fast. The Air Force captain nobody took seriously had just pulled off a danger-close gunfight in zero visibility and brought home a Swiss cheese. By lunchtime, the story had grown teeth. By dinner, it had wings. The SEALs requested her call sign. When someone told them it was Ghostwalk, Webb nodded slowly. Good name, he said. She walked through fire and none of it touched her. But that wasn't quite right, and he knew it. The fire had touched her. The A-10 proved it. She just refused to fall. That night, Rhea sat in her quarters, staring at the wall, replaying every moment. The dive angle, the trigger pull, the sound of tracer fire passing too close, the red lights blooming across her dash. She'd done her job. 6 men were alive, that's all that mattered. Except somewhere inside, in a place she didn't examine too closely, she felt the weight of all the people who'd said she wasn't enough. Felt the vindication she didn't want to need. Felt tired. There was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Colonel Hendricks standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. "Didn't mean to disturb you, Captain." "No problem, sir." He hesitated, choosing words carefully. "That was exceptional flying today. Textbook execution under impossible conditions." "Thank you, sir." Another pause. "I should have trusted you sooner, that's on me." Rhea met his eyes, saw genuine regret there. "We got them home, sir, that's what counts." He nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "The SEALs want to buy you a drink, probably more than one. Thought you should know." After he left, she sat back down. Didn't smile exactly, but something eased in her shoulders. Outside, the desert night settled over Bagram. The A-10 sat under floodlights, maintenance crews already swarming to assess the damage. Ramirez worked quietly, cataloging each hole, each system failure that hadn't quite failed. The aircraft had held together through circumstances that should have killed it, just like its pilot. In a different part of the base, the SEALs gathered in their team room. Someone mentioned the pilot's name. Webb looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Ghostwalk," he said softly. "Remember that. She's the reason we're having this conversation." The next morning, Rhea reported for duty expecting the usual routine. Instead, she found her A-10 grounded pending repairs and a summons to the wing commander's office. Her stomach tightened. In her experience, summons meant scrutiny, questions about risk calculations and rules of engagement. She knocked, entered, stood at attention. Brigadier General Corman looked up from his desk, face unreadable. "At ease, Captain, sit." She sat, hands folded, waiting. Corman studied her for a long moment. "I've been reading the incident report from yesterday's engagement. 37 gun runs in contested airspace, 27 holes in your aircraft, 6 men extracted without a scratch." He paused. "Some people are calling it reckless." Her jaw tight. "Here it comes." Corman leaned back. "I'm not one of them. I'm calling it the finest display of close air support I've seen in 23 years of service. That SEAL team is alive because you put your aircraft between them and a company of Taliban fighters. Because you understood the mission wasn't to survive, it was to make sure they did." He slid a folder across the desk. "I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The paperwork's already moving." Rhea stared at the folder, not trusting her voice. Corman continued, gentler now. "I know your history, Marchant. I know you didn't get the platform you wanted. I know some people see the A-10 as the consolation prize." He gestured toward the window, where her battered aircraft sat under repair. "But yesterday, you reminded everyone what that ugly bird can do in the right hands. You didn't just save those SEALs. You validated every pilot who's ever been told they don't have the right stuff." She found her voice. "I just did my job, sir." "The hell you did. You exceeded every standard, defied every expectation, and brought home an aircraft that by all rights should be scattered across a mountainside. That's not just doing your job, that's being exceptional at it." After the meeting, Rhea walked across the tarmac in a daze. The morning sun was already brutal, heat shimmering off concrete. Ahead, a group of pilots clustered near the flight line. F-16 jocks mostly, the fast-mover crowd that had always treated A-10 drivers with benign condescension. They saw her approaching. The conversation died. She tensed, ready for the usual dismissive nods. Instead, one of them, a major named Patterson who'd barely acknowledged her existence in 6 months, stepped forward. "Captain Marchant, hell of a show yesterday." The others nodded. One of them, a lieutenant she didn't know, actually saluted. "We heard the tapes, ma'am, that was incredible." She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and kept walking. Behind her, she heard Patterson's voice. "That's Ghostwalk, remember that name." It followed her across the base. In the Chow Hall, conversations paused when she entered. not hostile, curious, respectful. The maintenance crews who'd written off A-10 duty as career purgatory now looked at her bird with something like pride. Ramirez worked 18-hour shifts patching holes and replacing systems, refusing to let anyone else touch the aircraft. "She brought you home," he told Rhea. "I'm making sure she can do it again." 3 days later, the A-10 was airworthy. Barely. The flight surgeon tried to ground her for mandatory rest. She ignored him, filed a flight plan, and took off on a routine patrol that felt anything but routine. The aircraft handled differently now, slight pull to the left, a vibration in the stick that hadn't been there before. But she flew, scars and all, still capable, still deadly, just like her pilot. That afternoon, the SEALs found her in the operations building. 6 men in tan flight suits, faces weathered and serious. Webb stepped forward, extended his hand. "Captain Marchant, we didn't get to thank you properly." She shook his hand, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You don't need to thank me, that's the job." "Maybe, but you put yourself between us and a very bad outcome. That's more than the job, that's courage." Another SEAL, younger with a fresh scar across his jaw, spoke up. "We heard you took 27 hits, heard you kept flying anyway." "The A-10 kept flying, I just held the stick." Webb smiled. "We're not going to argue with you, ma'am, but we wanted you to know every man on that ridge owes you his life. That's not a small thing." They left a patch on her desk, their team insignia with a handwritten note, "For Ghostwalk, who walks through hell so others don't have to." She stared at it for a long time, feeling something crack in the armor she'd built around herself. All the years of proving, of grinding, of being told she wasn't quite enough, it didn't disappear, but it mattered less somehow. The mission mattered. The men who went home mattered. The rest was just noise. That night she finally went to the bar where the SEALs had invited her. They bought her whiskey, told stories, treated her like one of their own. She mostly listened, nursing her drink, watching these warriors decompress. At some point, Webb raised his glass. "To Ghostwalk, may she always bring the thunder." They drank. She drank. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rhea Marchant felt like she belonged. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Rhea flew her missions, each sortie adding hours to her logbook and depth to her reputation. The A-10, now bearing its battle scars as permanent testament, became something of a legend on the base. Pilots walked by it, touched the patched fuselage like a talisman. The story spread beyond Bagram, carried by the pilots rotating home, the SEALs who told anyone who'd listen about the warthog driver who'd saved their lives. At Fort Bragg, the tale grew mythic. At Hurlburt, it became required listening for new CAS pilots. The video from her gun camera, grainy, violent, precise, circulated through classified channels, analyzed in tactics courses, studied by people who needed to understand what right looked like when everything else was going wrong. But Rhea remained Rhea. Quiet, focused, uncomfortable with the attention. She flew because flying was what she knew, what she'd fought to keep doing when the Air Force had tried to redirect her career into staff positions and administrative purgatory. The A-10 had saved her as much as she'd saved those SEALs, given her a purpose when the fighter pipeline had closed its doors. Now, taxiing out for another mission, she ran through the checklist with the same methodical precision she always had. Ramirez stood by the aircraft, hand raised in salute. She nodded, advanced the throttles, and lifted into a sky that looked exactly like every other sky she'd flown through, except it wasn't. Something had shifted, not in the missions or the aircraft or the desert below, but in how people saw her, how she saw herself. The radio crackled. "Ghostwalk, this is Reaper 2. Good to have you overhead." A ground controller she'd never met, in a position she'd never seen, acknowledging her presence like it meant something. Because it did. She clicked the mic. "Reaper 2, Ghostwalk, happy to be here." And she was, not happy in the simple sense, but satisfied in a way that went deeper than adrenaline or accomplishment. This was her place, this ugly, lethal, bullet-riddled aircraft, this mission, this sky. She flew the patrol, eyes scanning for threats, mind running through scenarios. When she landed 3 hours later, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rust. She climbed out of the cockpit, legs stiff, back aching, and stood for a moment looking at the A-10. Ramirez approached, grinning. How'd she handle? Like she always does, perfect. They walked toward the hangar together, pilot and crew chief, partners in the stubborn art of keeping broken things flying. Behind them, the A-10 sat silent under the floodlights, holes patched but visible, a monument to resilience. To the idea that being damaged doesn't mean being defeated. That sometimes the things the world dismisses, the ugly aircraft, the overlooked pilot, turn out to be exactly what's needed when everything else fails. That night, lying in her bunk, Rhea thought about the distinguished flying cross sitting in paperwork somewhere, the medal she'd never imagined receiving. Thought about the fighter jets she'd wanted to fly, the career path that had seemed so important once. None of it mattered the way she'd thought it would. What mattered was simpler, cleaner. 6 men alive. An aircraft that refused to quit. A mission completed when failure would have been understandable. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, sleep came easy. In the darkness of the Afghan night, the base hummed with the sounds of war, generators, rotor wash, the distant thump of artillery. And on the flight line, under stars older than memory, an A-10 Thunderbolt II stood ready. Scarred, battered, unbreakable, just like the pilot who flew it. Months later, the award ceremony took place on a crisp morning at Bagram. Rhea stood at attention, uniform pressed, boots polished, feeling profoundly uncomfortable. Formations like this weren't her element. She belonged in a cockpit, not on a stage. General Corman read the citation, his voice carrying across the assembled personnel. Words like extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry that felt too large for what had happened. She'd just flown her aircraft and pulled the trigger. Simple actions with complex consequences. But as the distinguished flying cross was pinned to her chest, she caught sight of the SEALs standing in formation. Webb met her eyes, nodded once. That gesture held more weight than the medal. After the ceremony, she escaped as quickly as protocol allowed, heading back to the flight line where Ramirez was prepping her bird for an afternoon sortie. He glanced at the medal on her chest, grinned. "Fancy hardware, Captain." "It's just metal, Ramirez." "No, ma'am, it's proof." He gestured at the A-10. "Proof that when they tell you something can't be done, sometimes they're just wrong." She climbed into the cockpit, settling into the familiar seat, hands finding the controls through muscle memory. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and she taxied out, leaving the ceremony and the attention behind. Airborne, she felt herself settle. This was real. The stick in her hand, the gauges telling their stories, the weight of ordnance under the wings. The sky didn't care about medals or recognition. It demanded competence, respect, absolute focus. She gave it all three. The mission was routine, overwatch for a convoy moving through a contested valley. She orbited at altitude, scanning for threats, ready to bring fire if needed. Nothing developed. The convoy reached its destination safely. She returned to base as the sun painted the mountains in copper and shadow. Another flight logged. Another mission complete. But that night in the officers' club, something unexpected happened. Pilots from across the base, F-16 drivers, helicopter crews, even a B-1 pilot passing through, bought her drinks, asked questions, wanted to hear the story firsthand. She deflected, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but they persisted. Finally, Patterson, the F-16 major who'd saluted her weeks ago, leaned across the table. "You know why we keep asking, Captain? Because most of us have never had to make the choices you made that morning. We fly fast, high, safe. You flew slow, low, vulnerable, and you did it to save people who couldn't save themselves. That's not just skill, that's character." The table fell quiet. Rhea stared at her drink, searching for words. "It's just the mission. Any of you would have done the same." "Maybe, but you're the one who did it. That matters." Later, walking back to her quarters under a sky crowded with stars, she replayed the conversation. For years, she'd measured herself against the pilots who flew the platforms she'd been denied, had felt lesser, diminished, relegated to the slow, ugly aircraft that nobody wanted. But tonight, something shifted. The A-10 wasn't a consolation prize. It was a weapon system that demanded a specific kind of pilot, someone willing to get close, take risks, absorb punishment for the sake of the mission. Someone who understood that speed and altitude were luxuries, but effectiveness was everything. She'd spent so long trying to prove she deserved better that she'd missed the obvious truth. She was exactly where she belonged. The next morning brought new orders. Her squadron was rotating back to the States in 2 weeks. Rhea felt the complex mix of relief and reluctance that came with leaving a combat zone. Relief because she was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical. Reluctant because this place, these missions, had given her something she couldn't name. The days counted down. She flew every mission available, logging hours, building institutional knowledge. Ramirez and his crew worked overtime keeping the A-10 mission ready, determined that Ghostwalk's bird would fly until the last possible moment. On her final combat sortie, the sky was clear and impossibly blue. She flew north along the mountains, following valleys she'd memorized, passing over villages that had become landmarks. The radio was quiet. No troops in contact, no emergencies, just peaceful overwatch. It felt anticlimactic, but that was good. Quiet meant people were safe. She started her descent toward Bagram, watching the base resolve from a collection of shapes into buildings, runways, the organized chaos of a forward operating base. This had been home, would always be part of her story. The wheels touched down. She taxied to the hardstand, shut down the engines for the last time. Ramirez was there, eyes red but face composed. "Hell of a deployment, ma'am. Couldn't have done it without you. This bird wouldn't have made it home without your work." He nodded, ran his hand along the fuselage one last time. "Take care of yourself, Captain, and remember you proved them all wrong." She left the flight line carrying just her helmet bag, leaving the A-10 for the next pilot, the next mission, leaving her piece of the war behind. The flight home was long, anonymous, crammed into the belly of a C-17 with 100 other personnel rotating out. She slept fitfully, wedged between her gear, dreaming of gunfire and red warning lights. When they landed stateside, the air felt different, clean, soft, missing the edge of constant threat. Her parents met her at the base, faces lined with relief and something like awe. They'd followed the news, heard the stories. Her mother hugged her hard, whispering, "We're so proud of you." Her father just looked at her, veteran to veteran, and nodded. He understood what she'd done, what it cost. The medal, the stories, those were public. The rest was private, carried in places that didn't show. In the weeks that followed, Rhea tried to adjust to garrison life. Training flights over empty ranges, safety briefings, the endless administrative grind of peacetime military service. It felt hollow after the sharp clarity of combat, but she adapted. Flew her missions, mentored younger pilots, slowly found her rhythm. The story, though, that kept growing. Articles appeared in military publications. The Air Force used her gun camera footage in training videos. The SEALs she'd saved reached out periodically, checking in, maintaining the bond forged that morning when death had come close and been turned away by 30mm fire. One afternoon, she received a letter forwarded through official channels. The handwriting was careful, unpracticed. It came from a young girl in Texas whose father had been one of the SEALs on that ridge. The letter was simple: "Thank you for bringing my daddy home. When I grow up, I want to fly like you." Rhea sat at her desk, holding the letter, feeling something break and mend simultaneously. All the years of fighting to prove herself, the countless small battles against doubt and discrimination, they suddenly felt different. Not erased, but recontextualized. She'd become something she never intended, an example. Proof that the path mattered less than the destination, that being underestimated was just an obstacle, not a verdict. She wrote back carefully, honestly. Told the girl to work hard, stay stubborn, never let anyone else define her limits. Sent the letter and hoped it would matter. That night she drove to a bar near the base where pilots gathered. Ordered a whiskey, sat alone, content to be anonymous. But word had spread even here. A young lieutenant approached, nervous but determined. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you Captain Marchant, Ghostwalk?" Rhea sighed internally, nodded. The lieutenant's face lit up. "I just wanted to say I'm about to start A-10 training. Everyone said it was a dead-end platform, something for pilots who couldn't hack fighters. But after hearing what you did, I requested it. I want to fly what you fly." Rhea looked at him, saw her younger self in his earnest face. "The A-10 will teach you things other aircraft won't. It'll make you earn every mission. But if you're willing to do the work, There's no better close air support platform in the world. Will you tell me about it, the mission I mean, what it's really like? She hesitated, then nodded toward the empty chair. He sat and she talked, not about the glory or the medal, but about the weight of responsibility, the trust that ground forces placed in you, the sacred contract of close air support. About learning to love an ugly aircraft that refused to quit. He listened like his life depended on it. Maybe it would someday. When he finally left, thanking her profusely, Rhea sat back and smiled. The torch was passing. Not to clones or imitators, but to pilots who understood what mattered. That night, driving home through the quiet streets, she thought about legacy. Not the formal kind, enshrined in citations and ceremony, but the real kind. The lives touched, the standards set, the proof that doing your job with absolute commitment could change things. The A-10 she'd flown sat in a hangar somewhere, being repaired for its next deployment. Another pilot would climb into that cockpit, feel the weight of those controls, carry that aircraft into harm's way. The battle damage would be patched, painted over, invisible. But the story would remain, passed from pilot to pilot, a reminder of what was possible when competence met courage. Ghostwalk would fly again, in other hands, other skis. And somewhere 6 men lived their lives, fathers, husbands, sons, because one morning an underestimated pilot in an underappreciated aircraft had refused to let them die. That was legacy, that was enough. Rhea pulled into her driveway, killed the engine, and sat in silence. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges. Tonight she'd sleep well. The war hadn't ended, it never really did. But she'd done her part, flown her missions, brought her people home. In the darkness, she whispered the words she'd carried since that morning. Nobody gets left behind. Not on her watch. Never on her watch. And somewhere in the vast machinery of military memory, the story of Ghostwalk settled into permanence. A tale told in ready rooms and tactics courses. A name spoken with respect. A standard held up when people needed reminding that heroes don't always fly the fastest jets or win the glory everyone sees. Sometimes they fly low and slow, absorbing fire meant for others, turning their aircraft into shields and their courage into salvation. The SEALs had stopped believing rescue would come, until her A-10 crawled home riddled with holes, carrying its pilot and its mission and its absolute refusal to surrender. That's when they understood. Ghostwalk didn't just fly aircraft. She walked through death so others could walk away from it. And that made all the difference in the world.